welcome everyone to the podcast. I'm here with Yair today, who is the founder of a really exciting product called Zaraz, which is now a part of Cloudflare. And he's building really an alternative to Google Tag Manager that is faster, more secure, and more privacy safe. And he's also got some really interesting perspectives on the marketing technology space as a whole and where things are heading. And so I thought it'd be really interesting to have kind of a bit of a conversation about that and share some of your thoughts with our audience. So I guess the best place to start might be your founding story for Zaraz, like what the problems you saw, how you came across them, and then kind of how you decided to solve them.
Cool, sure. First of all, thanks for having me. I guess the story begins. So I was a web analytics consultant for many, many years before starting Zaraz. And when Yo'av, my co-founder, and I started working together, we were obviously looking for like a big market to tackle and problems we're very familiar with. And he's obviously the expert of everything web. And in my previous work as a consultant, I noticed patterns of issues throughout my entire customer. So I was working with like the leading internet companies in Israel, mostly consumer businesses. So like e-commerce publishers, sites that bring a lot of traffic, and I was dealing with implementing GTM and the entire Google Analytics stack and Google Ads, but also Mixpanel and the rest of the third-party analytics tools. And the problem we actually started with is data accuracy. So we noticed what everyone know that tracking breaks all the time. So like you have duplicate pages all over the place. You have sometimes you release new versions of your website and you forget to add, I don't know, at the time it was GA track, then it was data layer pushes, now it's Zaraz track. You forget to add the event to the button and suddenly you're not even aware and your analytics is just inaccurate and you're spending millions of dollars on marketing in the wrong channels because you don't measure the results correctly. And we all know this story. So at the time I went to my boss and I was like, yeah, listen, I see these patterns all over the place. We should automate the solution. And he said like, no, our job is to be consultants. We sell hours of work and not products. So I was like, maybe I'll build it myself. And then Yoav and I actually started building a QA software for web analytics and third-party tools. And with that software that was really basic at the time, it used to crawl your website, detect all the third-party tools on the page, and check for the most common errors like duplicate events, duplicate page views, missing events. So you could also record a flow. And if we would see in the network that I click a button and the event is not sent to Mixpanel, for example, we would alert you on that. So with that software, we joined Y Combinator, the Silicon Valley startup accelerator. And despite us thinking it's a great product, we couldn't sell it. We had a few customers, but the YC partners' expectations were massive. They were like, you need to get to 1 million ACV really, really quick. And I was like, I can't sell for $500, so how can we do that? And I think we had something like 130 demos in 1 month. And we realized that we have serious issues with that QA software, that people don't want to buy it just because no one wants to deal with another GA bug. It's something like, despite the fact that head of analytics or like the marketing departments of companies really like the idea of having more governance and clean data, the fact that you just create more bottleneck on the engineering team wasn't something very appealing to customers, let's say. So we sat with the YC partners and they were saying like, okay, so that obviously doesn't work. What else did you hear? What feedback did you get?
Mm-hmm.
And we sat down and we're like, what did we hear? And then we noticed that as I mentioned, our crawler used to check every page on the customer's website, and we used to come to demos with like a scan report. And one of the reports was just a basic coverage report, right? So we would show you all third parties detected on your website, and the pages where they exist, the pages where they're missing, and the percentages of that. And when people saw this report, the first reaction was, first of all, like, whoa, we have so many third-party tools, because we were scanning websites with sometimes 70 to 120 different third-party tools. So they didn't know they are using so many third parties. And I think this is really important, because what we realized is that because there is a third-party solution for different teams. So you have the product team with their product analytics stuff, or like session recording things, or analytics stack, and you have marketing with their conversion pixels, and you have advertising with like all the ad performance stuff. No one really knows what's what we are actually loading on websites. So I think the first reaction was like, okay, there's definitely lack of management. Like, no one understands what's going on. Sometimes you have legacy tools that are there from the beginning of the company, and it could sit there for 20 years despite the fact that no one used it.
Audit it, right? Because it's such a big job and often such a mess that it's like just a really painful task for someone that ultimately most people kind of don't recognize as important or reward in the right ways.
Yeah, exactly. So first of all, people, they change roles, so they come and go, and then someone is leaving the company with all the knowledge. Usually, one or two person that deal with a specific implementation of a tool. So then the company is left with no internal knowledge on how exactly they want to deal with it. Also, I think most developers really hate those kind of tasks. It's not an intellectual stimulating task to add or remove third-party events most of the time. So it's kind of get neglected, and people didn't realize at the time that the performance hit and the security risks are that big, which we helped educate the market. So now I think it's clearer and clearer. But yeah, anyways, people were seeing this report and they were like, oh my God, we use so many third-party tools. And then the second and third questions were like, how does it impact our page speed and loading times? What's the impact on SEO? What happens if one of the tools been hacked? And when we sat there, we realized like, oh yeah, that happened again and again. Like, many people asked about it. And at the time, our partner was Michael Seibel, who was the CEO of Twitch and the CEO of YC. And he gave us the task of like, do you know if third-party tools are slowing down websites? And we were like, no. And so he told us, okay, take 8 hours and figure it out. So this is what we did. We spent a night basically crawling the entire web. So we were targeting like the top websites in the United States. I don't remember how many we actually scanned, but it was in the tens of thousands. And what we did is a simple bot that will load the website that it is a few times, and then it will block all third-party requests, just to get a simple understanding of if we compare the same website on production with or without third-party tools, what's the impact? And then we realized the impact is huge. So the average slowdown caused by third-party tools was like 40%. Specifically, like if you, we're not talking about third-party, like, I don't know, jQuery. We're talking about third-party marketing and analytics tools mainly. Also widgets and chatbots, which we also solve for today. But, all the tools that we copy and paste to our website or we put through Google Tag Manager. And yeah, so, and I think 3 important things happen at the same time that kind of got us to realize there's a massive business here. One, it was the year, I think, it was winter 20, where just before COVID hit, where Google announced that Core Web Vitals are going to be used to rank your website on the Google results. And so the reason why customers were the first question or the first reaction to the third-party list was, does it impact my SEO? Was because Google were pushing their advertisers, like their customers, to start dealing with Core Web Vitals and improving their metrics. And so it came to us. Second thing that happened at that year, Google also, it didn't happen in the end, but they were also kind of releasing some punishments for slow websites. They were thinking about creating this error, not an error message, but something like a pop-up when you visit a slow website on Chrome and things like this. I'm glad it did not happen, but customers were really worried about Core Web Vitals at the time. And also privacy became a big deal. Then we realized, okay, we might be able to do something about it. And at the time, Segment was already quite big, but we realized that while Segment was, so you could load, for example, Google Analytics and maybe even Facebook at the time on what they called cloud load. But still, no one gave you the opportunity to offload all of the tens of third-party pixels, what we call. So all the marketing conversion pixels and the advertising pixels, there was no solution for it. And Segment and Google Tag Manager actually only made the problem bigger because it made it seem like it was easier to load more tools, right? Because it demands less coding. So you could just, every marketeer now can add a new conversion pixel through Google Tag Manager. So it actually created more third-party JavaScript loaded.
Yeah, interesting actually over the last few years that all of those vendors, right, have started to move more, provide more options to do things server-side. So whether that's like Segment offering more things in cloud mode, or whether that's Google Tag Manager launching a server-side version, there's definitely a trend in the industry that to try and move stuff out of the browser, for I guess all the reasons you just talked about.
Yeah, and I must say I'm pretty proud in our team. I think we led in the innovation front. I think we figured out some things early, and I'm happy that they were picked up by other teams as well. For example, the way we dealt with conversion pixels, because again, now we see more and more advertising platforms or the social media platforms opening their APIs, right? So we have conversion API for Facebook, and now we have it for Snap and for TikTok and for all of these. But at the time, most of them didn't have those things, and they were still using third-party cookies, right? So if you use third-party cookies, it means the request must live from the end user's browser. Otherwise, you won't be able to retarget them with ad campaigns or to even measure the performance well. And so I think we were the first, and the credit goes to the CTO, to Yoav, to basically what we've done is we were building the end requests on workers on the server, which is not really a server, right? Because we run on the edge, so it's, let's say, on the edge. So we were building the request, and then we would pass it back to the browser and send it from the browser. So this way, our customers did not load the third-party JavaScript. So for example, if you would want to use LinkedIn inside tag, you wouldn't include a LinkedIn tag, the pixel, the JavaScript itself on the website, but you would still send a request from the end user's browser. And so you would get all the features that came with it, like the ability to retarget or to measure conversions without slowing down the page. There was some performance hit. It's just one request leaving the browser, but the computation did not happen in the device. It happened on our Cloudflare worker. And then, GTM server side is now doing it in a very limited way. I think only to Google Ads. Maybe we would start seeing it more and more. But yeah, I'm very happy we played an early role there, and I think it was nice seeing how the market shifts. And now we see it more and more. Like I'm very happy to see that more third-party vendors are just opening up APIs, so we could all report entirely server-side without anything happening in the end user's browser.
Yeah, that's interesting. And do you think? I think you were in an interest. Actually, sorry, we should probably go back and talk about what Zaraz actually is. Like, what's the product you're actually building? Because I know
Oh
I
yeah,
introduced it very briefly, but I'm sure it would be better in your words.
true. Good point. So Zaraz load third-party tools server side. We offload the loading from the browser to the backend. The idea is that you can use all third-party tools without loading any client-side JavaScript. So, for example, tools like Google Analytics, Facebook API, TikTok, we would load them on Cloudflare Workers, which is Cloudflare's edge computing platform. And yeah, the idea is to basically offer customers much faster web performance because third-party JavaScript is just the number one cause for slowdown today, and actually more control over privacy and security. Because you do not load third-party scripts on the site, you're basically really diminishing the attack surface of your website. And we offer a lot of tools to protect user data better. So for example, with Zaraz, you can hide IP addresses when you send them to Google. You can trim them. You can basically manipulate the payload sent on the edge before it even reaches the third-party server. So from the user's perspective, it's very similar to the flow of Google Tag Manager server side, where you basically create the third-party tool, you define the actions you want to take, the triggers that should trigger them. It's, I would say, more oriented towards developers who try to keep it super, super flexible. And also Zaraz behind the scenes using a technology we call Managed Components, which is an open source project that the community is more and more engaged with, which is really cool to see. So yeah, you can theoretically build any tool with Zaraz and load it with a custom managed component today.
Yeah, and I think it's the other thing I think is really interesting is every time I log into a new Google Tag Manager container, I'm surprised by the amount of mess I see, right? That often things have been implemented by different people at different points in
Yeah.
times with different sets of standards and naming conventions, but also like often there's just a huge amount of duplication, right? Because ultimately, I mean, you can create a single trigger for each event and then trigger multiple tags off that, but way too often we see people creating like one trigger for every tag, and then like I think the kind of very nature of custom HTML tags, which still, despite templates being available now, still seem to make up the majority of tags out there, means that you're often like replicating the same business logic and the same kind of, I guess, code across multiple different destinations or even for multiple different tags for the same destination. And so you end up like executing ultimately way more code than you need to.
Yeah.
I guess that's one of the big problems you're trying to solve.
Yes. So we definitely wanted, and I hope we did manage to improve it, even if a tiny bit. We wanted to offer a much better user experience that will also enforce more governance and more kind of consistency. So it starts with basic design decisions, like in Google Tag Manager, for example, for in many containers, for every combination of event and tool, you have a different tag, right? So you would have like Google Analytics, event this, Google Analytics, event that. So the list just becomes enormous and it's really hard to keep track. So our most basic design decision at Zaraz to begin with was like, let's gather everything under a tool. So in Zaraz, even the first list you see is much easier to grasp, I think. It's easier to allocate a row in this tools table to a specific either tool, or like even if you have multiple instances of the same tool to a specific domain or so it starts with those things. But I think the approach we were trying to take is, and this is why I said it's aimed more towards developers, is unlike GTM, that I think it's kind of a hack. So GTM is like a parenthesis in the code, right? You want to let marketeers do the developer work. In a way, this is why it was created, because there was more and more need for marketing teams. Hey, please change this pixel. Hey, please add this conversion tracking. Hey, so engineering teams were like, guys, that's too much work. Here's a tool for you, just manage it yourself. But this creates a lot of issues, right? So we were trying, for example, we do not use the data, like we have data layer compatibility, mainly because most of our customers are big enterprise customers and they're shifting from GTM. And so we don't want them to redo the entire code base and change every data layer push. But we really took a different approach. So we have unified APIs. There's Zaraz Track, Zaraz Set, Zaraz e-commerce, where you basically, once you implement, for example, e-commerce API, you can leverage it to every tool. So we standardized it. We were trying to stay very close to how developers work. Another example would be in GTM, I think this feeling of like getting a messy container and not even understanding what's going on has to do with what they call JavaScript variables and also the custom HTML and custom JavaScript options there. I think GTM is not the place to manage code. And it's clear, like you can see code snippets that no one understands usually what they even do because so we splitted it, for example. You have in Zaraz, instead of the JavaScript variable, you have what we call workers variable. Workers is where Cloudflare developers that work with Cloudflare products are used to writing code. And so you write your code in workers, but you can use a worker as a variable inside Zaraz. So like we kind of split it. And I think managed component, and I'll finish with that, is again our attempt to give as much flexibility as possible instead of you just, for example, if you're missing a tool, instead of taking their JavaScript snippet and just load it as custom HTML script. We see more and more now, and it becomes weekly, which is really cool. People are just building their own managed components, and then they load it as a custom managed component. So managed components is a standard to build tools that can natively run on Zaraz. We also open source another what we call component manager that's called WebCM. So because we really don't. We do not want to compete over like the library. We're trying to standardize the way we think building third-party tools are the recommended way, or our approach at least to run tools.
And I think that decision to go open source is a really interesting one, right? Because I mean, ultimately, you're building a proprietary product that you're trying to sell, but I think also like open sourcing the standard probably changes the way in which you build that and the way in which hopefully it's adopted. Can you talk a bit more about that and what why you went down that path, I suppose?
Yeah, I'll be very honest about it. I think the main reason we went, so it's a combination of this was all when we started, our mission was to make the web faster and more secure and more private, and we really believe in it. So open sourcing, it's really in our nature and and a character. So, and I think also at Cloudflare is like in general. So to achieve that, we also face an issue, right? So there are thousands of third-party tools, and there are always new third-party tools, and we can only do so much. Unlike GTM, where most people just load custom HTML scripts, so you can use it with any vendor, we wanted to achieve something bigger. So the decision to use the community help was quite obvious. And we're really happy to see that it's been picked up. And now we see vendors just releasing their own managed components. And for them, it's also great because it's a way to get to more customers easily, because we usually add them. There's some standards you need to follow, but we can also add them to the library of tools we offer. So the adoption is very easy. But again, like we never want to lock customers. So the idea of open sourcing was also, it's a mutual effort of the internet now to kind of change this wild west of how third parties are, what third parties are doing on the website. I think the best thing about managed component is that it's a little bit like an app store. When you download an app, it asks for permissions. So managed components have to get permission to do things. So it's by design much more secure and better for everyone. And so, it's a mutual effort. And we also did not worry that much because we know our edge, and our edge is on the edge, because Cloudflare, really, it's very hard to compete with the level of service we can give, just for the fact that like we have the widest network around the world, and our Zaraz runs on every data center Cloudflare has. So it's like, I think today more than 280. So we will win by just being the best component manager, that loads faster with that gives customers the easiest and smoothest experience. But we would be really happy to see others adopting managed components, and we started seeing actually. So it's kind of cool.
Is that individual companies adopting managed components within their own stack, or is that like other tool providers offering it as a service?
Both. So there is this scenario of a customer that only uses, for example, GA4, so paying for the entire component, like Zaraz solution. It doesn't necessarily make sense to them. So usually they use Cloudflare workers, but only to load one specific tool, and they have quite a simple setup. So we've seen some of this. And I don't think we've seen companies writing their own managed components, and some people use WebCM, which is something we built in open source. So people will have an alternative to Zaraz to load managed components that is free and unrelated to us. We try to maintain it, but I think some people contributed to that project as well, but no one yet built, a full-blown competition or competitor for Zaraz.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, and then one thing you touched on a bit earlier is the fact that you're offering common APIs for things like e-commerce events and track events. And I think like that's actually a really important point, not just because it makes life easier for developers and it makes it easier to maintain an implementation of all these third-party tools, but I think also for the implications it has for the data downstream in those tools, right? Because one of the most common problems we see is that customers have adopted lots of different tools and they've implemented them all slightly separately, or maybe they've implemented them in the same way to track the same things, but gradually over time that drifts as one implementation is updated, or one is done at a later point in time and gains some additional data, or maybe use a slightly different trigger. And that creates these ultimately that creates like data silos, or like inconsistencies between tools, and like that then starts to erode the trust that people have in the data. And I think that's something that's really easy to underestimate, because you think actually it's not that hard to keep them consistent. But the second you have multiple code paths, like every time I've seen it happen, it starts to drift over time, right? And like ultimately once people stop trusting the data, they stop using it, or they start spending more time checking it than they do actually using it for what they're intending to. And so like I think, and I hope that like lots of the people who do adopt Zaraz actually do adopt those common APIs and use them as their primary source of truth, and don't just migrate whatever mess they have in a legacy tool into a new product. Because whilst they'll get some benefits from doing that, right, they'll get the page speed, for example, and they'll get some security benefits, they won't necessarily see kind of that long-term improvement in data quality and trust that actually will like accelerate their ability to use data, get more people across the organization using data, and like ultimately get them a lot more value from all the work they're putting in to track things in the first place.
That's a fair point. I think standardizing how you track is probably the most critical point. Like if you have this figured out, then the rest is easier. Like it's gonna be much easier to maintain accuracy across tools, and sometimes on the same tools. I think all of us owe Segment some kind of I think they were the first to hack this with Analytics.js, which is also open source. But this idea comes not from us, it comes from Segment. I think one thing that we contributed to it, again, because Zaraz natively works with other Cloudflare products, cool thing I started seeing is because okay, so you can do two things with Zaraz. You can just have your own custom HTTP tool. So
Hmm.
sorry, just an HTTP request. So like what we started seeing is people use the Zaraz APIs as the infrastructure for both third-party implementation, but also their first-party data collection.
Yeah.
So imagine you could I don't know, you implement all the e-commerce funnel steps with our e-commerce API, and you can pass the payload with a simple HTTP request to your Cloudflare worker or to um, uh, any other endpoint over the internet. So you get the same context, the same data, and we've started seeing people building complete BI tools with it. Because with workers, you can run whatever transformation you want. We've seen cases where people take this data and from workers, they kind of reach out to, for example, Salesforce to enrich the data and then save it on their own data warehouses or data lakes. So yeah, it's pretty cool. So it's just, I think, another layer of it's not only standardizing third-party analytics usage. Sometimes we see people just rely on the APIs for their own data, which I think is very powerful.
That's really interesting. And I think you're right. Again, creating that consistency between what you're doing in your data warehouse and your BI environment and what you're doing in your
Yeah,
marketing technology tools, or knowing that the event that goes to Google Ads is the same event that goes to your data warehouse, and then ultimately
exactly.
if the two don't add up, it's because the data is being processed in a different way, not because you've got some bug in collection that means that one tool's getting like
Yeah,
more like that Google are seeing 3 times as many conversions as you are, or like or whatever it is. And those
yeah.
again, it's like the time that those things eat up and the way in which they prevent you from making progress, because ultimately you're questioning the data more than you're using the data.
Yeah, and I think it's also the flexibility that developers have now. So it becomes with workers, for example, to build what's called today reverse ETLs, where
Yeah.
you grab data from a third party and then enrich your data with it and save it no matter on a different third party or your own data. It's just super easy. Like you can really build it in a few minutes with workers.
Yes.
It's quite powerful. So yeah, that's cool to see. I think it's a big improvement to all of us.
And what's next for Zaraz then? Like, what are you building next?
Oh my God, yeah, there's so much to do. Honestly, I think that so we are thinking of a lot of privacy related
Yeah.
features. We take it very seriously. Actually, a story. So when French CNIL, the French Data Authority, they had some kind of a ruling and guidance onto how like Google Analytics is non-compliant unless you load it this way, and then they kind of
Yeah, because they
uh,
were exporting data to the US, right? That they,
exactly, yeah. So they came with a bunch of requirements that if you want to load Google Analytics, you need to follow to be considered more like reliable and compliant with their perception of GDPR and all the regulations. Um, So we sat down over a weekend and we said, okay, we have to give our users just a toggle on solution for each one of the requirements. So like you cannot pass for example, the IP address. Then with a toggle on now, you can hide the originating IP address of your end user from Google Analytics and Facebook and other tools. Um, we kind of clean automatically the user agent from, for example, browser versions that in combination with other things can lead to a specific user. So we really are trying to make privacy enforcement technical issues easier for our customers.
yeah.
But there is a lot of space to grow there. So we're thinking about building what we call the data loss prevention feature for Zaraz, where basically you can always scan the entire payload for specific rules, like, for example, never include an email address in any request going to a specific tool and
Yeah.
more custom stuff. So that's one big thing we would want to
Interesting.
work on. And a lot of enterprises are concerned about now more and more.
Yeah, and it's a
And
hard problem when you're using third-party JavaScript,
yeah,
right? Because you have so little control over like yes, with like the Google conversion pixel, you can now turn on, like at least within GTM, you can turn on and off different features,
Yeah.
like and make it somewhat more privacy compliant. But you don't really, especially with kind of smaller third parties, you don't really understand everything that that JavaScript is doing on your site. And even if you do, there's no way to kind of 100% assure that, right?
Yeah. Well, when you load someone else's script, you would never have a way to ensure that, right? Because you're also not loading the actual script. You're basically requesting a remote resource that could change at every moment, but your snippet won't change. You wouldn't even be aware of it. So yeah, that's definitely a big thing, and I'm really looking forward to releasing that.
Mhm.
Another domain we're investigating now is kind of allowing more actions with Zaraz. So when I say actions today, an action could be like, I don't know, send data to Mixpanel or Amplitude or Google
Yeah.
Analytics. It could be load something on my website, like the script. Um, it could be send an HTTP request, but it could also be maybe trigger an email or we're working on something we call Zaraz embeds. So for example, uh, when you load a news article, you have those Twitter embeds or social media embeds, right? These are also third-party scripts. And when you load the page, you're actually requesting all the media, right? Like the images, the text. So that creates a lot of slowdown. And as part of Cloudflare, we also have this amazing ability when we proxy a website to just, inject code into the HTML. So we're working on basically rendering those social media posts, for example, on the edge. And it will work in a way where you kind of tag the place on the HTML where you want Zaraz to load them, and the entire rendering will happen on Cloudflare, so not on your end user's device, which is pretty cool. So this is another area we explore, Zaraz embeds, and basically how to deal with things that you actually see on a website that belong to third-party tools, widgets, embeds, things
Things
like
like
this.
live chat as well, and other like yeah.
Yeah. This you can also already do with Mesh components. So that you can load like assets, CSS and stuff with Mesh components today. But yeah, more complex stuff around things you actually see on the site.
Mhm.
And I honestly think we have a lot to improve in making configuration easier. I think the less development in AI is pretty promising in that front. And I'm curious to see what the team will come up with regarding this in the future.
Cool. Well,
Yeah.
I think we're a bit over time anyway, so I think like thank you again for joining us on this today. I think it's been a really interesting conversation, and yeah, I've really enjoyed it.
Yeah, me too. Pleasure to be here. Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Cheers.